Hello and welcome to Wellness Wednesday. This is Dr. Mike Ronsisvalle. Super glad you guys are with me for these Wednesdays. I'm enjoying it. Hope you guys are enjoying it. We've got some cool content today. I wonder how many of you are struggling with boundaries. And here's what I'm going to guess. If you're like the overwhelming majority of people that we work with in our Live Well clinics, drawing boundaries with other people is super tough, really tough. So I'm going to just share some information with you. I'm going to start with a story of my own journey with boundaries that I think will kind of set the stage for how we can begin to draw better boundaries in our lives. So let's just jump into it. I was 32 years old. I was a new psychologist. I'd been practicing as a licensed psychologist for maybe, 2 years, probably 3 years. Started up in Georgia. We moved to Florida, and I started with one little suite of offices. And I'm not talking about like 10 offices or 5 offices. I mean, I had like an office, and a waiting room, and I rented that from some other therapist, and I had like $500. I mean, that was literally this massive leap of faith. And I just said, I'm moving home, and I'm going to speak into Central Florida. That was really the burden, my burden professionally. It was a burden for my wife and I, just to be able to speak into the people that we grew up with and our friends and our family. So man, we just jumped and we moved back to Florida, and I started what was then called Florida Counseling Centers. I ended up selling those clinics after several years, and God really blessed us. But man, when you're starting a new business, it's an unusual experience. I got to tell you, it was interesting. It was daunting. It was awesome. It was terrifying. Like, there's all this emotion that was going on. And my response typically to that kind of situation is, I'm just going to work harder than anybody else. And I've done that my entire life, right? That's what I try to do. I'm going to hustle and work harder than anybody. I did it in sports when I was growing up. Man, my family was full of fantastic athletes. I had cousins that were Division I football players trying out for professional football teams. And man, I was trying to hang with these guys my whole life. And the only way I could hang was this: if I hustled harder, if I worked harder. So I'd get in football games or basketball games, it didn't matter what we were playing. I was going to spin myself. I'll throw up on the sideline. I'll do whatever I've got to do to try to hang, right? And that's how I got through life. Even when I got to school, that's what I did. Boundaries weren't really a thing for me when I was going to school, because I thought, I've just got to work harder. I'm going to work harder than anybody else. And, some of it was mitigating anxiety and stress. I don't want to fail. I don't want to fail out of this program, especially when you get to grad school and you're working on your doctorate. It can get tough, right? Because it's competitive, and you've got to write dissertations and find research and be the first to arrive at a conclusion or find a problem to solve. And so I worked hard. That was my MO, man, my whole life. So I moved to Florida. I start this practice with nothing, and I go after it. Like, I work harder than anybody else. I just made rules for myself. I had, 3 clients at the beginning. We moved down here. So I have a full-time job. I have a family already. I've got a wife. I had my first son. 3 clients. How do you do that? How do you even respond to that? You work hard, right? And so as I did that, what I found is the harder I worked, the more I felt like God blessed our efforts in the community, the more He blessed my profession and my business. That's a weird situation to be in, because you feel like, well, I don't want to quit working hard, and I'm exhausted, and I probably need to say no, but I don't feel comfortable saying no because I want to pay my bills. And so I just double down and double down and double down. And the end result of that is that I was pretty tired, guys. You fast forward maybe a couple years, God is blessing. We feel honored to be able to do what we're doing. I felt honored to be able to do what I was doing, for sure, in the community, and working with people and seeing healing take place in their lives is awesome. But I was tired. I don't know any other way to say it. And talk about my dad at certain points during these talks, and really when I speak anywhere, a lot of times my dad will come out because he was a mentor for me. He was a huge figure in my life growing up. So early in my career, I had moved home. I was trying to see my dad, and I remember my dad walked into my office one day, which was very unusual. He did not come to my office. I was sitting around, didn't have a client, right? So he walks in the door, and the lady that worked for me was like, "Hey, your dad's here." So it's like, okay. I bring him back to my office. I'm like, "Hey, man, what's up? I don't know what's going on." He said, "Mike, I want to tell you, I had a dream." And when my dad said he has a dream, it's not like other people. If somebody else tells me they have a dream, I'm like, okay, great, congrats. You ate pizza last night. Whatever caused that. I'm not a big dream interpreter, but my dad, I feel like this guy, I don't know. He has like some sort of hotline with God. And the dream was, I dreamed that you had a pet lion, and I talked to you about your pet lion, and during the conversation, you told me you were super excited because you were getting a tiger. So you're going to have a lion and a tiger. And I was expressed concern in the dream. I told you I didn't think it was a good idea. You said, "Dad, I'm getting the tiger." And the next day I found out the tiger ate you. I was like, is that a nightmare? What is this? But I don't know what that means, Mike. He told me, I don't know what that means. But I just knew I was supposed to tell you that. What I took from that, and look, I'm not going to get into whether dreams have relevance for people. That's another topic. What I do know is that it spoke something to me, and it emphasized what I really knew on some level already. And that was that I was going to have to figure out how to start drawing boundaries with people. We were safe, right? With the business was doing great, shockingly. I mean, like, I forgot this. Like I said, it was maybe a year or two in. I was totally surprised that, man, we were sustaining things and we were growing. It was awesome. But I knew at some point I was going to have to quit working so hard. Hustle, hustle, hustle. That guy, he knew he was going to have to start drawing boundaries. And so what I did in those moments is I did let myself start to say, okay, I'm going to say no to people. I'm going to be intentional about how I spend my time. I'm going to not be all things to all people. I was going to limit the kind of people that I was willing to see professionally and refer other people on to the counselors I had hired. So I made some real significant decisions in the coming weeks just based on my dad coming out my office was really just a tipping point. But what I want to share with you is the boundaries that I drew and some things that I learned as I started to, for the first time, draw boundaries in my life. I'll base a lot of what we're going to talk about today on some of the info from John Townsend and Henry Cloud. They wrote the book Boundaries, and it's one of the best-selling Christian books of all time. I don't know if you guys have read that. If you haven't, you probably need to get a copy of that book, because I'm going to give you a snapshot of what you could think about in regard to boundaries and what you could start implementing. But if you want to dig into this, the Boundaries book by Townsend and Cloud is kind of the gold standard. So if you want to get better at this, and this Wellness Wednesday just sort of whet your appetite, man, grab that book. I do not think you're going to be disappointed. Some of the principles that I'm going to talk to you about today are found in that book. And the reason I know that is because that's sort of where I was at. When I decided I didn't want to metaphorically let my own tiger eat me, my own business just kind of devour me, I dug into that book and some of those principles to say, okay, I've been teaching people about this for years. I am not practicing it. So what would it look like for me to start to practice that? So here's some of the things I learned. Number one, if you want to have good boundaries, you're going to have to implement the law of sowing and reaping. The law of sowing and reaping. And this principle really means that our actions have consequences. The actions of the people that you interact with have consequences. When we do loving, responsible things, people draw close to us, right? When we do unloving, irresponsible things, people withdraw from us. That's kind of what happens. So essentially, what happens when you practice the law of sowing and reaping is that you allow people to experience the natural consequences of their choices. So here's what I think about when I think about the law of sowing and reaping. If I'm a farmer, and I've talked to you guys about how I grew up on an orange grove, if you plant orange seeds in the ground, you never reap grapes, ever. You plant orange seeds, you reap oranges. You plant lemons, you reap lemons every time. Every time. And see, that's what's helpful for people in relationships, because a lot of times with boundaries, we just don't allow ourselves to give people the consequences that they really need to respect us and to respect our boundaries. So what I learned in those early moments is that I had to allow myself to not work harder than other people in relationships, even in professional relationships. So there were referral sources. There were people that I was trying to get clients from and business from. And man, like I said, remember Mike on the football field wasn't the most talented guy. He wasn't, the most athletic guy. He's going to work harder than anybody else. So that's what I did. I'd go to these people. I'd take them to lunch. I'd bring stuff to their office. I had my office staff going out trying to wine and dine. I'll do anything to get your clients. And what I came to the conclusion of in those moments is, wait, I can't work harder than these other people. If someone's not going to respect and honor the clinical work that we're doing in our offices and refer people to us, find the people that will. We're doing great work, right? And so that's what I did. Now, a lot of you need to understand the law of sowing and reaping in regard to your closer relationships, right? I was kind of dealing with it in business, but a lot of you need to let people experience the natural consequences of their choices. When you sow orange seeds, you reap oranges. When you sow dissension, lack of respect, hurt, pain, you reap distance. There's a lot of you, man, you double down. We meet with people like this all the time in our Live Well clinics. They double, triple down. They're like 30-year-old Mike in business. Doesn't matter what the other person says. Doesn't matter what they do. Doesn't matter how they treat you. You're going to do anything to maintain the relationship. I've got to maintain that connection. That's not going to work. If you want to draw boundaries, if you want to have peace, you've got to allow yourself to practice the law of sowing and reaping. People need to reap what they sow in relationships. That's a tough one. It's a tough one, especially if you like to control outcomes. One of the reasons that you double down and triple down is because you want to control things. Even if someone's being rude to you, disrespectful, they're not treating you the way that you deserve to be treated. This could be a spouse, a family member, a close friend. I don't care what you say or do. I'm going to continue to give you access to my heart. Well, that's not fair. That's not cool. That's not healthy boundaries. And the only way to have peace in these relationships and to get rest, like I did in business, is to allow yourself to say, okay, there's a law of sowing and reaping, and people need to reap what they sow. If they sow love into your life and they sow contentment and they sow investment, what should they reap? They should reap your attention, your investment in them, right? Like a mutually burden-bearing relationship. We should reap what we sow. Got it? That's the first law of boundaries. Really, really helped me in business. But I tell you, that has helped me help people in counseling for many, many years. All right, number 2. The law of responsibility. The law of responsibility is this: we're responsible to each other, but we're not for each other. We're responsible to each other, but we're not responsible for each other. So let's take a spouse, for instance. You may help each other with the loads of life, and that's appropriate. We're going to invest in our financial future, and I'm going to help you with the load of trying to eat healthy, or an emotional crisis comes along, and I'm going to be there and I'm going to be present, right? We can help each other with the loads of life, but ultimately each person must take care of his own daily responsibilities, right? So that includes your feelings, your attitudes, your values, your handling of life's everyday difficulties. We're responsible for ourselves in that regard. And people can mess this up. I think the law of responsibility for me when I was dealing with business is again, working harder than anybody else. Doesn't matter, what anybody does or says. I'll double down. So if clients needed me on the weekends, if they needed me at night, if they needed, 2 sessions a week because they just wanted more time, I was going to do everything to make sure that I took care of these people. And look, that's great care. And I'm not saying that's bad or wrong to do as a professional. What I am saying is that there were moments in my quest to just be the best psychologist I could possibly be that I wasn't allowing people to take responsibility for their own lives. I was working too hard. I was working harder than anyone else. And that was the case even in my administrative life of the business. I was saving people. If I had tasked someone to do something and they didn't follow through, I would do it. There was not a ton of accountability, right? I mean, I had some great people working with me and for me and always have, but that was my bad because I was too quick to rush in and solve things and fix things. And as a leader, was it my responsibility to share the load with them sometimes? 1,000%. Yeah. We've got this deadline. We've got to get things done. Can you help me out, Mike? Yes. Of course I'll help you out. That's part of being a servant leader. But see, what I would do in those moments is rather than just, share the load of their life, of their work life, I would assume the load of their work life. I would make their emergency my emergency. And so, we just need to look at that really closely in all of our relationships to make sure that we understand the law of responsibility and we understand what it means to stand shoulder to shoulder with people and do life with them, which is awesome. That's the way it's supposed to be. But there's a difference between standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody and literally being fused with them. So I know that plays out many times in the context of closer relationships. And I'll be honest, the people that struggle with this the most is married couples. Because it's an odd situation to try to figure out how to do boundaries in a marriage. If you believe we're one flesh, two shall become one. Listen to any marriage ceremony performed across the country in the last decade, 50 decades. We always talk about that when people get married. Two shall become one. Well, if we're not careful, what we do with that is we take that and we use it as ammunition to give ourselves sort of permission, liberty to not just share the load of daily living, but to ultimately take on that load as our very own. And that's the last thing you need to do in a marriage, especially. The last thing you need to do is take responsibility for your spouse's feelings, their attitudes, their values, the way they handle life's everyday difficulties. That's on them. If someone is angry, it's their anger. If your spouse is hurting, that's their hurt. If your spouse is annoyed, that's their annoyance. Let's extend it a little bit further. If your neighbor is disappointed because you don't come over or you don't follow through, that's their disappointment. Does that mean that you don't attend to those feelings? No. You absolutely do, but you just have to make sure that you can listen and hear and understand the emotion, have empathy for it, but maintain some sense of distance from it. Because what it does is, if you share the responsibility of life and you share everything, like you're struggling, it's my struggle, I'm all in, I'll work harder than you. What happens? They're not really being a full-fledged adult. They're not adulting. And there are some of you, God,